So as we said, we're going to talk about how to make the web faster, how to do better performance for websites. And I'm an ASP.NET developer. I work on an e-commerce site. I spend a lot of time working on performance, but this is really framework agnostic. Most of the stuff we're going to talk about as we go through are techniques anybody's going to be able to take advantage of. I won't spend a lot of time on this. The key part is at the bottom here. I've got my Twitter information, my email, and my blog. I do have the slides will be available. I'm going to have a link at the very end. And I also have the code. So I've got a fictitious travel site before and after. So I'm going to show before I did performance improvements and then after I've done quite a few performance improvements. Both of those code bases will be available and they're all just pure HTML. So you don't need any server-side framework to be able to execute any of that. So let's talk about performance rules in general. So as I said, most websites, there was actually some research years ago. So I worked on compilers a long time ago. So when I came to performance for my website, I was really focused on server side. You know, I'm C# developer. What am I doing on the server side that's making my pages slow? And Steve Sodders had done a lot of early work and saw that it's actually about 80 or 90% of the time is spent waiting for page resources. So for most people, it's not about optimizing your server-side code. I'm going to show you a lot of tools in the talk so you can identify, is it truly your server or is it something else? But unless you're Netflix or some of the others, most of us have very similar looking websites. And it's mostly the JavaScript, the images. Obviously, Netflix are a lot of video, but it's the images, JavaScript, where we place them, how we include them, that's important. There's three major rules for performance. We want to make fewer HTTP requests. I put that in italics because I am going to talk about HTTP 2 later. You still don't want to request stuff you don't need. But some of the techniques we used to use to reduce the number of requests are not as useful anymore with HTTP 2, so we'll get into that. We want to send as little as possible. You know, a lot of people use mobile devices for our websites, so we don't want to be using a lot of their bandwidth. We don't want to spend a lot of money on our own bandwidth. The less we send, the faster it's going to be. We also want to send it as infrequently as possible. So we'll talk about various techniques, and they roll back into these three major themes. I want to talk briefly about Fiddler because I'm going to show it throughout the talk. It's a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP and HTTPS. It was made by Eric Lawrence, was acquired by Telerik in 2012. I have a link there where you can get it. The current one I'm going to show you is what they call Fiddler Classic now. They're actually working on Fiddler Everywhere, which is a cross-platform, will run on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's still somewhat early in the development for that, so I'm going to still use Fiddler Classic, which is a Windows tool. But I'll show you the first quick indication of how I would use this for a lot of the performance stuff we're going to do. So again, I've got a before. So I've been to a lot of different places. I've just got some pictures. So this is our world travel site. You'll see as I scroll through, it's got some decent pictures. I'm not a designer, so I use Bootstrap. If I were to go look at what this looks like in Fiddler, we can see here, I've got the requests. I'll take out one I have here. And what I like to do is look at statistics. And I can see that the before site is about 3 meg, which is actually scary, but pretty typical for today. So that's not an abnormal size. It only has 12 requests, not too many hosts, which is a little atypical, but that was the before version of the site. So I took Bootstrap, I took some images from my camera and put that together, and that's about how big it was. I'm going to clear this out here. I'm going to go look at the after version of the same site. So this is some of the motivation. If you look at it, it visually will look the same. The quality is the same. It's going to behave the same as the before version. But if I were to go back into Fiddler again and look at the statistics again, I can see that I'm down to 268K. So the entire after site is smaller than some of the images. Like a single image on the before was like 300K. So we're down to about 270K for the entire thing. So we're going to go through all types of different techniques we're going to use to get us from here to there. But again, visually it looked the same. We're just taking advantage of some of these techniques. I'm going to use Fiddler throughout, so if you hadn't seen it, I just wanted you to get a look at how it's used. It's often the first tool I'll use if I do performance reviews of someone's site, because I know what kind of things I'm looking for, and it's a quick way for me to spot check. We'll talk briefly about metrics. There's a lot of different metrics that you might want to focus on. The first one, if you're an IT person, is first byte. So I may want to look at, that's really the server-side processing. How long did it take for the browser to send to the server, go over the network, have the server-side code execute, come back to the client with the very first byte. So if I'm in IT, I'm somewhat interested in that number just to make sure all of my backend servers and my page is performing. I've switched recently to use speed index. So speed index was created by WebpageTest.org not that many years ago. What they wanted is a better metric that represented what a user for your website would see. So that number is a number that indicates how long it takes for the majority of what they call above the fold, which is basically the visible portion of my website, to actually be done painting. So it's a good indicator of when a customer might feel that the page is done. There are several others with time to interactive. The traditional was always on load. A lot of tools supported that. That's just when all of your images, CSS and JavaScript, are done downloading. And fully loaded is when it sees there's no more network traffic after the onload is done. In case you're doing backend calls or AJAX, that'll be fully loaded. Google just came out with Web Vitals not that long ago, which is kind of a combination of 3 different things. The largest contentful paint, so the biggest part of your page is painted. The first input delay, when someone could first put a cursor in a box and get something to run. And cumulative layout shift is just things aren't moving around. You've been to a lot of websites where things kind of shift, so that measures how much shift you have going on. So I'm going to focus for myself on speed index. It's still what I use. It's a good number that indicates the user feels the page is done, but I just want you to be aware that there are other metrics out there that you can monitor. There's different ways to measure. So I'm going to show you WebpageTest.org, which I use a lot. It has agent computers all around the world that I can use for free. So I can go pick an agent, I can pick a speed, I can pick a browser, point it at a URL, and it'll give me a good measurement for the site. Like I said, I do use Fiddler for ad hoc. I also there's 2 different types of monitoring you can use for your websites. I've used synthetic monitoring for many, many years for our e-commerce site, and that's basically a set of agent computers for me around the United States that are hitting my homepage every 15 minutes and recording how fast it is. So that's nice. When I do a performance change, I have a set of common computers to compare against. You can also do real user monitoring. I'm very interested in this. It does tracking of all of the users who come to my site, their actual experience. So using both of these techniques is useful because I get a good taste for how my site is behaving. So let's go look at webpagetest.org. So like I said, this is free. I can come out here, punch in a URL, choose the location, a browser, lots of different settings. I didn't want you to wait here to actually see me do this. So I have hosted the before version and the after version on Azure. And this is the result for WebpageTest. So again, all the metrics are up here. I can see first byte. It didn't take too long, about 400 milliseconds to get my first byte down. My speed index, though, was about 5.4 seconds. And so about 5 seconds before someone feels that the page is done. We've got the Web Vitals and some of the other. A couple things I like about this, you can come into the waterfall if you've looked at waterfall views before, and I can get a quick taste for which resources are taking a while. So you can see my Bootstrap CSS took almost, well, more than 4 seconds to be completely downloaded. And it breaks it into connection times and such. And we'll talk about this later, but browsers, this is an HTTP 1.1 site. They use 6 separate connections. So you can see it's making separate connections here. But you can see the images are pretty large and they're taking a while to download. What I like to do is look at the videos. So they actually record the videos. They'll keep these results out forever. So if you keep the URL, you can come back. But if we look at the before version of the site, this is what my customers would be experiencing, right? About 6 seconds, it feels like the page is done. If I go look at the same thing in the after version, again, my scores are a lot better. I'm down to just about a second, and I can go into the waterfall and look at things again and see that now my images are all downloading, 100 or 200 milliseconds or so. I can also see I'm using HTTP2, so there's one single connection rather than having to create separate connections. And again, if I get this, I like to use this with our marketing department. They don't always respond to numbers real well, but they do a good job when I can show them videos and show them that's the difference. It's very compelling. I can actually send the links just to the videos, and I'll say, this is before I do it, this is the after performance, just so they can visually see what technique we're using and what kind of an impact it has for customers. So again, that's a good measurement tool. Is it good enough? So Amazon and Walmart both did a test where they intentionally slowed their website in an A/B test, and they found for every 100 milliseconds, so that's a tenth of a second, for every 100 millisecond delay they added, they lost 1% of their sales. That's a huge impact. So if you can test your own site, so I want to do this on my site, I'd like to do an A/B test, intentionally slow some of my customers, so I could get a metric for how much does performance matter to my customers, because that makes every other discussion a lot easier. If someone comes and says, I want to add 10 more fonts to our website, I could measure and say that'll add a second, and then I'd be able to take that second against how much sales we'll lose, and then I can have a logical discussion about, does it make sense to use 10 fonts? Yes or no? Are you going to get enough value out of it? So that's kind of a good thing to do. It helps to compare yourself to others. And so I gave you some URLs here. If you go to Speed Curve, they've got major websites like Amazon and such, and they break down the screenshots of how long it takes them to load on mobile and on fast connections, just so that you can compare yourself. So when you see your speeds, you can talk to your internal people and say, we're on par with Amazon, we're on par with Walmart, just to know how well you're doing, right? And the question is, what's good enough? You don't want to just do optimizations forever. You want to be doing things that are making a business difference to you. So you want to know when to stop. The other one that's kind of cool, Google has Crux, which is basically if you're using Chrome on any of the devices and you opt into the telemetry, they're reporting back to Google, and I can actually go punch in. I won't wait for it here, but I'll show you what it looks like. If I come in and punch in a URL here, it will actually go out and look at that data and look at my site and give me back a report and say, people on mobile phones, it takes them about 2.2 seconds or whatever to get your home page. So it's very nice to be able to show, third-party data proving that you've made some improvements to performance. So that's another good way to measure. So now I'm going to jump into some of the techniques. Again, these all differ based on what web server you use and such. I'm not going to get into the how to configure all this. I'm going to talk about why you want it and show you some examples. So the first one you should look at, I've kind of ordered them in the order of easy and important. So one of the easiest things to do is HTTP compression. So what this says is if you've used zip files before, it basically takes your file and makes it much, much smaller. So I was running my data center in rural Minnesota, and we were running out of bandwidth, so we actually turned this on probably 15 years ago or more. And the day after we turned this on, we cut half of all of our bandwidth usage, and the synthetic measurements from our agent said we were 25% faster. So let me show you what that would look like. I will just clear this out here so we get a clear view. I'm going to go hit our after site again. I'm going to hit Control F5. So again, if I go into Fiddler, I can tell if I'm using compression or not. If I look at this bootstrap and go to the inspectors, you'll see where it's got on the transformer, it's got this little kind of goldish bar. It says I'm using gzip, and my result was about 37K. If I wasn't using gzip, it'd be about 160K. So you can see what a huge improvement that is. I can also play with, there's a newer compression called Brotli. It's down to 17K instead of 23K. It's slower, and it's not currently supported by IIS, so I don't use it. I'm still using gzip. But going from 160K down to about 24K is a huge improvement for almost zero effort. I just set up IIS and tell it to compress my content. The next one is content expirations. And the idea with this is I really want to leverage the user's browser's cache. So my goal, if you come to my website, the first time you come to my site, you're going to get my HTML. I'm an ASP.NET site, so I'm going to run the code. I'm going to give you the HTML. You're going to need all my JavaScript, my CSS, my web fonts, my images. My goal would be if you come back tomorrow and you make a request for my HTML, I'll run it. If I haven't changed anything else, I want to pull all the images, CSS, JavaScript off of your device's browser cache. It's never going to be faster than taking right off your own device. Why traffic all the way back to my server? So it saves me a ton of bandwidth. It's going to be a lot faster for you. So all I need to do is set an expiration. So if I go back to Fiddler and show you, you can see this max age. This is actually in seconds. So we literally will say we want to keep our CSS, our JavaScript typically for a year, and we'll typically put our images at about 30 days. And then if I do have an issue where I actually have to change something, let's say I change my company logo tomorrow. Today it's named logo.svg. I can just rename it to logo1.svg. And then what'll happen is none of the browsers have that cached already, so they'll come back and get it. So I get the best of both worlds. If the image hasn't changed, it's going to pull it out of your browser cache if you've been here before. If you don't set this, what you'll notice when you do traces, you're basically leaving it up to the browsers to decide when they come back to get that stuff. So it's going to be all across the board based on the browser. So if you've ever seen these 304 responses not modified, it was basically a wasted request. You went all the way back to the server to find out it hadn't been changed. I would rather be explicit and set the specific expiration. And then, like I said, I'll just change the URL if I need to. For our e-commerce site, we actually put a question mark with ticks. You can use a hash value, whatever you want. That way it looks at the file and adds that on to the end of the URL, and that makes the URL different, and that avoids it from the cache if it's actually been changed. So again, something easy to do, something you want to do. Another thing we've used years ago, content delivery network. So it's kind of funny how the internet works. We're all tooling along, doing our thing. Two people had a bar argument about which matters more. Does bandwidth matter more or latency? So you can go read that actual research paper, and they did the tests and said if we make the bandwidth better or we make the latency better, what has a bigger impact? And it turns out bandwidth matters for a little while. Obviously it matters if you're Netflix, right? You need a lot of bandwidth, but for average sites, latency is really what makes a difference. If you can make the time to the server and back be faster, that's where you're going to get your wins. Well, like I said, I'm in Minnesota with my data center. I'm not going to move you any closer, but what a CDN lets me do is I can basically leverage their global network of servers, and these servers are going to be closer to you than my data center in Minnesota. So I happen to use a US-based CDN. There's certainly a lot of global ones. If I was using a global one, there would very likely be a CDN server in Australia. So the first one of you that hit my e-commerce site would have to go populate that CDN with all of the images. But after that, all the rest of you would get served from a server within Australia instead of coming all the way back to Minnesota to get the images and stuff. So again, it offloads a lot of work off my primary web servers. I've used it for images, CSS, JavaScript. I've used it for fonts forever. There's a little caveat with fonts that we'll maybe get into. But the idea again is that these servers will be a lot closer to my customers than my data center. So again, we saw a lot of bandwidth savings, and it was much faster when we switched to use a CDN, and there's so many of them now. It's super cheap, and it's easy to switch back and forth every couple of years just to get a decent deal. I'll show you what that looks like in code. So I've got some VS Code here. So normally this would be how I would reference an image. What I'll do instead is when I get a relationship with a CDN, I'll pick a name like cdn.example.com. I'll change my image links to use that reference. And the magic of the CDN is when it does this DNS lookup for you, it's going to find the closest server to your location and give you back that IP address. That way it'll serve from that CDN server. And like I said, if nobody's been there yet, no harm done. The CDN server will come to my server, get it, and then keep it for the future. One other thing, if you've never seen this before, I'm using protocol-less URLs. If you don't specify HTTP or HTTPS, it'll use whatever protocol the page uses. So years ago, I had to support pages that did both HTTP and HTTPS, so that just kind of became a habit. Now I use HTTPS everywhere, but so that is a CDN. The next one we'll talk about is bundling and minification. So I put the bundling in italics, and we'll come back to that. But the idea with this is you want to minify your CSS and your JavaScript files. And basically, there's lots of tools to do it. They're just going to strip out all the white space and the comments and all the other stuff to make the file a lot smaller for you to use in production. I've heard people do it for HTML. Two things for me. I haven't found a good way to do it for my dynamic ASP.NET pages. And secondarily, sometimes when you remove white space, it impacts your layout for your HTML. So I just haven't gone after that. But when I minified my CSS and JavaScript, and I bundled all of my JavaScript into a single file and all my CSS into a file, we cut our homepage by 46%. So it's 46% faster, and it took 6 or 7 hours with a bunch of free tools. Basically, when we build our website, we run it through the process to do that minification and everything else. So let's look at what that would look like. So let's look at Bootstrap, for instance. So Bootstrap JS is about 134K. If you use the minified version, you'll see it's about 59K. So if you haven't seen these before, it looks like that, right? All the white space has been stripped out. You want to do the minification and the compression. If you're concerned when you go to troubleshoot on the client, dev tools have a way to do what they call pretty print. So you can essentially unminify it if you needed to, or you could simply have your debug build not do all the minification. But again, simple tools, simple techniques, use minified files. I'm not going to continue to bundle in the future because now I've switched over to HTTP2. So I will talk about why that matters when we get to the HTTP2 part. But minify your CSS and JavaScript, it will make your files smaller.
Robert, we just had a question
Sure.
in the chat. Back on the CDN, Ryan was just asking, did you have any recommendations around content expiration to balance giving users the most recent resources and the ability to reduce your latency?
Yeah, so the good thing for mine, I use the same expirations. So when I go here, I just choose an expiration. So I choose for our e-commerce site, we chose 30 days as a reasonable when we thought our images might change. Once I bundled my JavaScript and CSS, we actually put a version number on it. So we want to do a year. So your content expirations will flow through your CDN. So whatever you choose for your caching policy should be supported by a major CDN. And I go as long as I can because I know that if I do change a file, I can always change the name. So if I change the URL in any way, it'll skip the browser cache and the CDN, force it to come back to my server, get the freshest content, and then updates the CDN server at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yep, thank you.
Yep. So we'll get to images. So with images, in the past, before web fonts and before we had gradients in CSS and such, sometimes we would make images that had text in it with a certain font just because that's all we could do. Now that CSS3 is out, we can do gradients. There's a lot of things that you can do with just CSS3. So if you can do that, or if you can use web fonts, do that and don't use images. If you need to use images, it's important that you use the proper type. So if you're doing things like logos, you want to use SVG because it's a vector-based graphic and it will scale to whatever device you're on. And they're really XML files, so they compress really small. So if you're using a logo type thing or art, things that you typically would have used a GIF for in the past, you want to use an SVG. If you're doing photos, use JPEGs. And I've had this argument before with some people, and they said, well, you can use PNGs for that, can't you? And I said, well, you can, but I always say if you're not sure or you don't believe it, try it. So I've got, in Sydney, I did the bridge walk with my dad. I found out he's afraid of heights that day, by the way, but you can see the quality. Here's my JPEG. If I look at the same thing as a PNG, visually it looks the same quality. And yet if I compare these two, the PNG is 516K compared to 58K. So it's 10 times larger to use a PNG. And the reason is JPEG lets you trade off quality versus size. So I'll show you that in a bit and show you how you can optimize those, but just make sure that you're using the proper types. There's also WebP, which is one of the newer formats. The problem for me is it's not supported by all of the browsers I need to support. So I don't go through the work of trying to do WebP and support both. I just try to get properly compressed JPEG images, and I'm good for that. The other thing to focus on, I have a responsive website, so it works on phones, tablets, and desktops at different breakpoints. And years ago, there wasn't a good way to do that. Now there's both source set and picture. And so I'll show you the source set. What source set lets me do is I can specify, I have an image. This is my Sydney Harbor. I can create images of various sizes, and there's a lot of research on what sizes you want. You can go look into that. I just typically do sizes like this, and you can look at what kind of design breakpoints you have. But I also just embed the size right in the name of the file. So when I go look at my web server logs, I can know immediately which one is getting picked the most often. So all I have to do with source set is specify I've got all of these various sizes. The browser will figure out the connection speed, if it's mobile, if it's high pixel density devices, and it will choose the one that it thinks is the most appropriate and download that one. So the good news is in the past, all I could do was image, and I would typically do the largest I had, so it would look good everywhere. But if you look at the sizes of what that does, if I look at, we'll go up here. If you look, the 128 width is only 2K. The 2048 is about 187K. That's a huge difference. That's 100 times bigger by not getting the right image. So make sure you're taking advantage of responsive techniques so that you're serving the right image for the right device. I won't talk a lot about client hints. It's a newer thing where instead of doing source set, the client will send you more info about what it is, so you could just serve the right size. Again, it's not rolled out enough yet that I'm using it. I just want to tell you that it's out there. So talk about JPEGs. Again, the reason you want to do JPEGs is because you can compress it. So every time I say that, my designers, aren't very pleased. So I finally had to do this web page. I tell them, I'll make a deal with you. Here's the same image. It's got various compression levels. If you can tell me the original one that's the best quality, I'll use it. If you can't tell the difference between that and one I compressed, then I win and I get to use the small one. And so far I haven't lost. I throw in a couple freebies here, right? That one sucks. That one's pretty bad. You look at the rest of these, it's pretty hard to tell where the original image is and the ones I've compressed. So it turns out this one is 172K. If I look down here, You know, even side by side, it's very difficult to see a difference between those two. But I went from 172K down to 47K. So it's very easy. I use PaintShop Pro. At work, we use Photoshop, and you can actually create a batch script and tell it, take these set of images, kick out all these sizes, compress them at this ratio. So you get a lot smaller files, and that's where the win is. And that's my before and after, where I said I had images before that were 300K. I was able to get the entire site to fit under that by doing these kinds of compressions correctly.
Now, we just had someone trying to guess which was the original photo there. They guessed the top right one.
They guessed that was the best quality.
That's what they were thinking.
That one, if I can get my alt to work, let me go back. So this was 172. This was actually 31K. So it's very hard. I mean, the point is that stacked, you're not going to have them stacked side by side. And unless you're a photo site, right? I mean, if you're a photographer and it has to be absolutely perfect and you're willing to take that performance hit, most of us, that's not worth it. And like I said, in PaintShop Pro, you can actually pull the image up side by side, and it has a slider. You can see right at the point where you start to see visual degradation. That's where you stop, just short of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Back to the source set, there's a question from Mark. Yes. Sort of, do you still need to specify the source attribute as well, or do you just specify the data source set?
You can do the source set, and I'm going to come back to why it has data here. If you put the source, it would have been a fallback for older browsers that didn't understand source set. I don't use it. I mean, with the browsers I support, they all support source set now. I haven't shown it yet, but if you haven't been out here, there's a site called Can I Use? You can actually come out here and punch in HTML5 features. If you put in source set, you can see it's pretty well supported. I had to support IE11. There's actually a polyfill that will let me run it picture fill that lets IE11 act like it understands source set. So I've used that for years. I'm about, thankfully, to drop my IE11 support. So I'll be able to go just to native. But like I said, I'd even have it in the source here now that I say that. If I go to, nope, I took it out. So if you get picture fill, it'll actually support the older browsers and make IE11 understand source set and picture, if that makes sense. So you don't have to actually specify like here, I just left the source off.
Yep, thanks, that's good.
Another thing that used to be cool years ago, it's called progressive JPEGs. And for those of you who've been around for a while, I'm going to remind me to turn this back off. I always forget, and then things are slow. So you can make Fiddler act like it's on a modem. And I want to do that because I want to show you what a progressive JPEG looks like. So watch this. This is the same image. Which one feels like it's faster? Obviously, the one on the left, right? Turns out JPEG has two ways to save. On the left is what's called a progressive JPEG, and on the right is what the traditional baseline JPEG is that most of us use. Most of the internet, 90+% is this kind. You can just save it as a progressive, and people who have slow connections will get a much better paint. So the impression is from the left side, it comes in kind of blurry and gets better quality. You sure feel like the left side is a faster site than the right. So I've been exploring, now that we have so many more mobile devices on our site, I've been exploring switching all of our product pictures back to progressive. There's a lot of research on it. The file sizes are about the same. There is some commentary from people that some people don't like the blurry feel on the left, and they don't know when it's done. But if you were on this slow of a connection, I guarantee you would like the left better than the right. So it's something I still have to go back and find out. Is this something we're actually going to do and run it through some testing and get customer feedback and stuff? But I just wanted to make you aware that that's something you can do. Another thing you can do is you can take metadata out of your images. So another cool feature in Fiddler, there's an add-on called Show Image Bloat. So you can go out to Fiddler, download this extra extension. I'm going to turn it on. If I go back to my browser, I'm going to hit a page I have here, and I'm going to hit Control F5. You see these bricks? It's telling me that 14% of this image is actually metadata, not actually visually useful data. So if I go back and look at what that looks like, if you've seen, I'll do this one. So these were actually obviously pictures I took when I was in Australia. It stores my camera, the shutter speed, right? Nobody cares about that. None of my customers want to see. That's just holding up my download for no reason whatsoever. If I go into this one, you'll see all of that's been stripped. And so I use a tool called JPEG It's a free tool. It's a command line interface. There's lots of other tools to do it. Just run that image bloat against your site, and you can see places where you have images that have unnecessary metadata. The only reason you'd use it if you buy images, some places that sell the images require you to leave the metadata because they put stuff in there for copyright and such. But if they're your own images, take it out because it has no visual impact whatsoever. And you can see 15% of this download would have been wasted otherwise. So that's some quick image stuff. Another thing I've used a lot is image lazy loading. And so I have been using this for years. I actually use this plugin called Lazy Sizes. It's very popular. What you do is instead of saying source, you switch it to data source, or as you saw in my example, data source set. What you're claiming is this image is not visible when someone first comes to the page, so why load it? We just recently did more lazy loading and deferment, which I'll talk in a minute, and we again cut our homepage time in half, because why make people download all of this stuff they may never look at? I'll give you the warning, there is native support. This just came out built into Chrome and New Edge and a couple of the other browsers. It's not out enough yet that I can drop this. So I'm just going to show you this, but I wanted you to know that that's out there. So again, if we go back to the after version, all of these images that are below the fold here, right? When I first came here, why download these? What this plugin does is as I'm scrolling, it sees this image is about to be visible, so it goes and downloads it on the fly. And so all three of those were on the fly. So let me close my, or clear my cache here quick. And I'll show you that in Fiddler, what that looks like. So again, if I go back and I hit Control F5 and we go into Fiddler, I'm just going to mark the last request that was made. And then if I go back and scroll down, you'll see if you're on a super slow connection, sometimes there'll be a bit of a delay and you can play with the threshold values, but generally that's a good trade-off. You can see those 2 extra images. That's 200K that I didn't need to download, right? I didn't need that to slow up your initial page request because you may never scroll down. So it's a good trade-off to make. So again, that's image lazy loading. Lately, I've also been doing a lot of what I call deferred loading. So I had to write this myself because I haven't found anything that does this, but we use a lot of third-party beacons and other resources on our website that I also don't want to slow down your paint. So what I did is I've got code that will, if you put data deferred source instead of source, it will actually download stuff after the onload fires. So if I go show you what the code looks like. So there's the magic JavaScript. It's just looking once the page onload fires, which should be well after the speed index paint is done. It's going to look through the source and find anything that has data deferred on it. And it essentially just changes this data deferred source. It copies this value, puts it into source in this case. That tells the browser to go get the image now. And same thing with JavaScript. So this isn't a great example because I wouldn't do it on a primary image above the fold. I just wanted to show you that it all works. And I can actually make all of my third-party JavaScript load after onload is done. Okay, so again, I looked at our site. I had a whole bunch of JavaScript for analytics and all this other stuff that had nothing to do with painting the page. I would actually defer all of that. So now the paint happens right away, then the onload fires, then it starts doing all this stuff in the background. And again, that was a good trade-off for us. So that's deferred loading. So I like to use that if I can. I want to push it as late as possible. They've actually added something into JavaScript not a couple of years ago where you can actually do what's called async and defer. So I'm going to show you these. I don't like these quite as much because they still can impact my paint in some ways. But I do want to show you how they work because they are standard and built into browsers. So first, I'm going to show you another cool trick in Fiddler. I've got this auto responder. I set up rules that are looking for alert 1, alert 2, and alert 3, and I'm going to make them intentionally slow. So I'm going to make the first one take 4 seconds, the second one take 2, and the last one take 3. I'm just simulating if I were pulling these from somewhere on the internet and it was slow. So again, if we look, I've just got these 3 JavaScript files, and then I've got my content. So if I go make that request, the important thing is, look, my customers don't see any of my content. They're sitting here waiting for these JavaScript files to finish, and then the content finally appears. If it turns out that the JavaScript is not necessary for the paint of the page, I can put this async. What I'm telling it is, download that in the background. As soon as it's done, run it. So let me save that. I'm going to go back and clear my browser cache just to make sure that that behaves like I want it to. If that goes a little faster. So hopefully that's cleared. We'll find out here in a minute. Now that I've done the async, I'm going to go make that request again. And the important thing is, look, the content's already done. Then it's running, but look what happened. It ran the second one first, third, and then the first. When I say async, I'm claiming just run these one in the background. Whenever they get here, run them. I don't care what order they're in. Sometimes that's useful. If it turns out I've got libraries that depend on each other, I can instead do defer. This will do the same thing. It says, go ahead and paint content right away. Don't wait. But you need to run 1, 2, 3 in order because the dependency matters. And again, I'm not going to bother showing for time here how that works, but you'd see the content would paint right away. Then those 3 would fire in order. Again, great techniques. The problem with this is these still will run as soon as they get downloaded. So it's possible I might have other stuff in a big page that these could still impact. That's why I tend to like my deferred technique better, but you can test that out and see if that works for you. Another thing that's come in browsers in the last few years is what's called resource hints. And these are just things that I can put into a browser to influence when things are downloaded and when I make connections. So I've got a page here, right? Let's say I'm going to pull some jQuery here from ajax.microsoft.com. The parser is going to run, and I've got a JavaScript here that I'm going to make be intentionally slow. So the browser would be coming through, and it's going to sit and wait for this. It's going to take a while before it eventually parses and finds this. I can give it some hints. So I can say, you know I need to go to Microsoft.com. Why don't you go get the DNS resolved? So in the background, go do DNS and figure out the IP address. So that's kind of cool. I actually prefer this one. Please pre-connect. So in other words, I know that I'm eventually going to make you go to ajaxmicrosoft.com. Start that connection right away because TCP connections along with HTTPS take a while. So all of that work could be done before it actually gets down and starts trying to get the file. If I know I want a specific file, I can actually ask for it to be preloaded. So I don't typically do this. I've been looking more at doing pre-connects, but you could say, I know that I need this JavaScript file. I still need to actually load it. So I need to uncomment that so it actually makes the request. But if I did this and uncommented this, you'd see it's out making this request before it ever figures out that it needs it. So test it. I've seen some people made a huge difference for their site. I've done quite a bit of testing on my site, and it hasn't made enough of a difference for me to bother yet, but they're cool techniques. This is another cool one. If you happen to have a website where if they come to this page, you're pretty certain they're going to go to this page, you can actually put this pre-render. It will go start downloading this page in the background along with all of its images, JavaScript, whatever, and actually start rendering it. So if the person did actually click and go to this page next, it could be instantaneous, right? Because it's already all done and sitting there. Again, all the trade-offs in life, right? I could also be wasting all of your bandwidth and your data plan for a page that you never go to. So it's one of those things you have to see if you happen to have a site that you know where they're going to go, might be a good idea to try that. So those are some of the resource hints. Couple notes. So lately I've been focusing on this critical rendering path, which is I've done all these techniques before. Lately I've been doing a lot of lazy loading and deferment because I want to make sure that what matters gets here first. And what matters to me is I need to get the important CSS down first so the page can start to paint. And I want to try to delay everything else that I can. Couple other miscellaneous things. If you didn't know it, URLs are actually case sensitive, which is important. So if I pull up this, you can see I'm referencing the same image here, flag bridge, but I'm using different capitalization like capital B, small b, all lowercase. So I've got the same image here, 4 different ways. Well, 3. These 2 are the same. And if I go over and show you what that does in a browser, I'll actually clear it out here in Fiddler. If I make that request, those are my images. Looks like I still have some metadata in there. Shame on me. And I'm going to turn that off and do it again so it's easier to read. So the point here is if I go back into Fiddler, what happened? I downloaded the same exact image 3 times solely because I did my casing wrong. So when we learned this, we switched our rules and said for us, it was easier for everybody to remember. Every one of our URLs is always lowercase. All of our references to images, JavaScript, CSS, because if one of us chooses to use different casing, everything else I did for caching and stuff goes out the window. You already had that flag image sitting in your browser after the first request, and you just wasted another, almost 100K getting the exact same image just because I did the casing wrong. So be aware that casing matters from a browser's perspective. I don't have a lot of time to go over these other 2, so I'm going to skip those for now because I want to talk about HTTP 2. So this came out in 2015. We started using it on our CDN first because our CDN supported it before my data center did. We weren't using a new enough version of Windows Server at the time. So we turned it on our CDN. There's a lot of great features in it. The one I want to focus on is in the past, when you had HTTP 1.1, if you needed to get, say, 25 files from a given host, HTTP 1.1 let you use 6 connections. So if you know how TCP connections work, each one takes a while to get set up, connected, and it takes a while before it's efficient. And so what they said in HTTP 2 is let's forget all of that. Let's just have one connection. And if I ask for those 20 files, I'm going to go use them all over one connection instead of having to spawn off these 6 connections and wait, right? When I spawn off 6 of them, I have to wait for the first 6 things to finish. So I want to show you a visual of why this matters. And I like this example and I hate this example at the same time, and I'll tell you why. Let me close Fiddler. Fiddler does not currently support HTTP 2, just so you know, so it would have not worked. So this is a test. It has 360 small images using HTTP. HTTP does not support HTTP 2. So that's a HTTP 1 site. And you can see it took about 4 seconds. If I do HTTPS, that lets me use HTTP 2. and you can see the speed difference. It was 85% faster. Now, the part I hate is I don't have a web page that has 360 small check marks on it, right? It's a little bit of an exaggeration of what stuff would look like. There's another one I can show you quick that shows you some of the latency. So if you're using HTTP 1.1 with a 200 millisecond latency, you can see the 6 connections. It takes a while to do them if I did the same thing on HTTP 2. So nice visuals just to tell you that HTTP 2 getting down to 1 connection makes life much, much better for performance. So given that, these are a bunch of techniques that I used to use that I probably am going to avoid now. And I just put the probably because, you know, it always depends on your unique situation. But I told you I used to bundle my JavaScript and CSS files. I took all of my 15 or 20 CSS files and put them into one. I did that because in the old world, every request that had to be made could slow things down. Now that it's HTTP 2, there's not a penalty for making those other 15 requests. The reason you might still want to bundle, compression is a little better when you bundle. So there's a lot of research out on this as well. People are saying you probably don't want to go from 1 file down to 100 JavaScript files, but you might want to bundle, have 10 bundles that have things that belong together. You probably also don't want to do domain sharding. So in the past, if you had cdn.example.com, people would cheat and do cdn1.example.com. That would get them 6 more connections. cdn2.example.com would get them 6 more. So they basically get 18 at a time. Now that we have HTTP 2 and you're only using a single connection, this probably isn't a good idea anymore. And then people also used to do inlining, where they would intentionally inline stuff into their HTML document just to avoid that extra request. Again, not necessary. The only one I would call out today is people who are very serious about web performance. One of the newer techniques is to take your CSS and split it into what is absolutely necessary to paint the above the fold content and what isn't, and split it in 2 parts and inline the part that's critical. So that still makes sense, but these other techniques probably don't anymore if you use HTTP 2, which I now use everywhere. Like I said, we've used it for years. Browsers that don't support it, just fall back and use HTTP 1.1 so you're safe. Couple quick tool things. I'll skip over this page speed because it's very much like Lighthouse. In Dev Tools, by the way, I'm a huge Edge fan. I've dropped Chrome and gone to New Edge because it performs so good and it's a lot better privacy. So let me go out to the before version of the site. If you hit F12 and go into Dev Tools, there's this Audit tab. So I can actually say, I want to check my performance on mobile. Please generate a report. It's going to go out and give me a score, which is interesting, but it's also going to break down for me a whole lot of recommendations along the things that we talked about today. So I got a 69 out of 100. It tells me what metrics weren't great, but what's cool is I can go down here and it tells me things like we've already talked about, right? I should be sizing my images better. I should use compression. I should try to eliminate render blocking things like defer the JavaScript files, minify my JavaScript files, minify my CSS. So if you're not real familiar with performance and forget some of the rules, it's kind of cool to come in here and have it ranked. If I go look at the after version, I'll just go run the same thing. We'll see if it's going to be a winner today. Oh, what did I do wrong? Oh, I didn't go to the other site. I'm sorry. That didn't come up right for some reason. So there's my after. Let me run that again. So what I like doing is I like before and after. I'll keep a web page test run. And again, what did I do? This is usually 100. You're killing me today. I'm going to do this and try that one more time. I like to do the before and after versions of things so I can see. Oh, I'll do the local one in case that matters. I switched to a new Azure host, so maybe that's what's messing me up. There we go. that's more what I expected. So again, it will still tell me things that I can improve and some diagnostics down below. Some of this stuff was not using HTTP2 that I might have missed. So again, it's very simple. It's built in dev tools, but I like to have the score as a nice metric to talk to marketing folks and say, look, we just did something. We were at 65, now we're at 80. That's better. We made some improvements. Here's how. But if you're new to performance, it's nice because it gives you a lot of details on what you could improve. Some quick resources. So I have Pluralsight courses, one on web performance that goes through a lot of this, a little bit more detail. You've seen some newer techniques today than some of that. I've also got a web developer's guide to images that shows you how to compress JPEGs, create progressive JPEGs, etc. I have my latest one on debugging your website with Fiddler and Chrome DevTools and another one on Fiddler if you're interested in those. That is my Twitter, my email, my blog. That is the link you're going to want for the slides and the code. And again, the before and after are both on there. So feel free after you get those, if you have questions, to reach out to me. And I have time still if there are any specific questions in chat or other things people would like me to review in more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone's got a question they've been hanging on to, feel free to post to the chat, or if you do have the raise a hand icon in the toolbar, you can do that. If it's a more complex question, you might want to unmute to ask it, but just give people a chance if anyone does have a question for Robert at the moment. Yeah, I guess we'll just give people a few moments if they are typing. I guess for me, my takeaway really is that the measuring, I guess, is that before and after, that sort of checking to see if something is actually making an improvement. That really seems to be a pretty important thing to be doing.
And like I said, the WebpageTest has been very helpful to convince marketing people to invest in performance things. And the visual and showing them videos and waterfall diagrams make a lot more sense than the hand waving, and the numbers and everything else seems to be a lot more compelling for them for some reason. But I do keep all of the URLs for history. So I just have a document of, here was our Lighthouse score before we did anything. We did deferment. Here's what it did to Lighthouse. Here's what it did to WebpageTest. Here's a link to the videos if you don't believe it. And I just keep a rolling document like that for performance differences for our site.
Cool. No, all I'm seeing is people saying they really enjoyed the presentation. So,
well, good. I'm glad it was useful.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So everyone, please join me in a virtual round of applause for Robert, and thank him for joining us. It's great to have sort of, well, I guess world-class presenters being able to join us here in Adelaide. But also, again, thank you everyone else for joining us today, for those from locally Adelaide, but also I think there are people here from interstate and maybe even overseas as well. So thank you everybody for participating today. Do feel free to reach out to Robert if you did have some questions later on. I'm sure he'd be happy to respond to those. And the recording hopefully will be up reasonably soon. I'll get to work on that. Thanks everyone, and we'll catch everyone again next month.
Thank you very much.